Paris, 1889. The air is thick with excitement, the scent of fresh pastries mingling with the chatter of thousands flocking to the Grand Exposition Universelle. The Eiffel Tower, newly erected, pierces the sky as a symbol of human progress, a monument to the ingenuity of a so-called enlightened Europe. But just a short walk from this iron marvel, another spectacle draws crowds, something far darker, far more unsettling. Behind iron bars, men, women, and children from distant lands, their skin darker than the pale faces gawking at them, are displayed like animals in a zoo. They are caged, their lives reduced to a performance for the amusement of the masses. The crowd points, laughs, and tosses coins or scraps of food, their eyes wide with curiosity and a twisted sense of superiority. This isn't fiction, this isn't a dystopian tale. This was real. They called it entertainment. They called it science. But what does it say about a civilization that builds towers to the heavens while locking humans in cages for sport? How could a society so proud of its progress, its art, its culture, turn people into exhibits? And here's the question that might haunt you. Was this just a spectacle, or something far more sinister? Picture the scene. A man from the Congo, dressed in a tattered loincloth, forced to sit in a mock village of straw and mud, surrounded by onlookers who see him not as a father, a brother, or a human with dreams, but as a curiosity, a living relic of a world they deem savage. Children tug at their parents' sleeves, pointing. Adults scribble notes as if studying a rare species. The man behind the bars meets their gaze, his eyes carrying a weight no one in the crowd seems to notice. This was the era of human zoos when Europe, at the height of its imperial arrogance, put people on display for fun. You might think this is a story of a distant, barbaric past. But what if I told you these exhibits persisted into the 20th century, not just in Europe, but across the Atlantic, in the land of the free? And what if I asked you to consider whether the shadows of this cruelty still linger in our world today? Stay with me, because this story isn't just about cages, it's about the ideas that built them and the scars they left behind. To understand how human zoos came to be, we need to step back into the late 19th century, a time when Europe's empires stretched across the globe like a spider's web, ensnaring continents and peoples in their threads. This was the zenith of imperialism, an era when nations like Britain, France, and Belgium carved up Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, claiming lands and lives as their own. The world was a chessboard, and European powers moved their pieces with ruthless ambition. But this wasn't just about land or resources, it was about power and the stories they told to justify it. At the heart of this era was a dangerous idea, the notion of racial superiority. In the salons of Paris and the lecture halls of London, intellectuals and scientists spun theories that placed white Europeans at the pinnacle of human evolution. Social Darwinism, a twisted misapplication of Charles Darwin's ideas, became the gospel of the day. It preached that some races were fitter and others destined to dominate, while others were doomed to subservience or extinction. This wasn't just abstract philosophy, it was a blueprint for oppression, a justification for colonialism that painted entire peoples as inferior, their cultures as primitive, their humanity as negotiable. Enter the world's fairs and colonial expositions, glittering showcases of imperial might, from London's Great Exhibition of 1851 to the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1889. These events were stages where empires flaunted their wealth, technology, and conquests. The Eiffel Tower wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a declaration of dominance. But alongside the steam engines and electric lights, there was another kind of exhibit: human beings. People from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were shipped across oceans, not as guests or equals, but as living proof of Europe's supposed superiority. These were the human zoos, where men, women, and children were displayed in mock villages, dressed in caricatured costumes, and forced to perform their savagery for crowds hungry for spectacle. Why did this happen? It wasn't just about entertainment, it was about control. By showcasing colonized peoples as exotic, primitive, or even subhuman, these exhibits reinforced the narrative that imperialism was a noble mission, a civilizing force. The African in a cage wasn't just a curiosity. He was evidence, a prop in a story that said, "This is why we rule." And they do not. The crowds didn't just see difference, they saw inferiority, packaged and presented for their amusement. But this wasn't a uniquely European phenomenon. Across the Atlantic, the United States, eager to prove its own imperial credentials, adopted the same playbook. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair featured entire villages of Filipinos, Native Americans, and Africans, each carefully staged to highlight their otherness. The message was clear: progress belonged to the West, and the rest of the world was a museum of backwardness, preserved for study and spectacle. This was the world that birthed human zoos, a world drunk on power, blinded by arrogance, and fueled by a toxic mix of science and prejudice. It was a time when the line between human and the exhibit was erased, not by accident, but by design. And yet, behind every cage, behind every forced performance, were real people, people with names, families, and stories that the crowds never cared to know. In the next part, we'll meet some of them, and through their eyes, we'll see the true cost of this so-called entertainment. The iron bars of the human zoos didn't just cage bodies, they trapped lives, dreams, and dignities. To understand the true horror of these exhibitions, we must step beyond the spectacle and meet the people who endured them. Their stories aren't just footnotes in history. They are the heartbeat of this tragedy, pulsing with pain, resilience, and a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Let's walk through three lives, three faces whose stories pierce through the crowd's laughter and reveal the cost of being reduced to an exhibit. First, there's Ota Benga, a young man from the Congo, whose life became a symbol of the human zoo's brutality. In 1906, the Bronx Zoo in New York City unveiled a new exhibit. Inside a cage, alongside monkeys and orangutans, sat Ota, a 23-year-old booty man, his teeth filed to points as part of a cultural ritual, drew gasps from the crowd. To them, he was a curiosity, a savage from a distant jungle, but Ota was no stranger to loss. His village had been ravaged by Belgian colonial forces, his family slaughtered, stolen from his home. He was brought to America by a missionary-turned-showman who saw profit in his suffering. For weeks, Ota was forced to live in the zoo's monkey house, sharing space with an orangutan named Dohong. Visitors jeered, threw bananas and marveled at the missing link they believed he represented. Ota's eyes, described by some as quiet and searching, rarely met the crowds. He spoke little, but his silence screamed of a man stripped of everything: his home, his freedom, his humanity. Years later, unable to bear the weight of his trauma, Ota took his own life in 1916, a gunshot ending a story that the crowds never cared to understand. Across the country, 2 years earlier, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair had turned entire communities into spectacles. Among them were the Igorot people from the Philippines, displayed in a mock village that drew thousands daily. The Igorot, proud Highlanders with a rich culture of weaving and ritual, were reduced to caricatures. Organizers forced them to perform exaggerated versions of their traditions, slaughtering dogs for feasts, dancing in loincloths, and chanting for the amusement of gawking Americans. The crowd saw savages who ate dogs, not families who had been torn from their mountains to play a role in a scripted fantasy. One Igorot man, whose name history barely records, was described as standing still at the edge of the village, his hands clenched, watching the crowd with a mixture of defiance and despair. He and his people were not just exhibits. They were prisoners in a theater of prejudice, their culture twisted into a sideshow to affirm the West's sense of superiority. The Igorot were paid nothing for their humiliation, and when the fair ended, many were left stranded, far from home, their lives appended for a season of entertainment. Across the Atlantic, the 1906 Marseille Colonial Exposition painted a similar scene of degradation. Here, people from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were displayed in a fabricated Indo-Chinese village. Among them was a young Vietnamese woman, likely a mother or sister, whose name, like so many others, was erased by the spectacle. She and her fellow exhibitors were forced to live in straw huts, wear traditional clothing stripped of context, and perform daily tasks: cooking, weaving, even praying under the relentless gaze of French spectators. The organizers called it an authentic glimpse into colonial life, but it was a lie. The village was a stage, the people props. The woman's hands trembled as she wove baskets for the 100th time, not because she was unskilled, but because she knew the crowd saw her as less than human. Children pointed at her, adults whispered about her exotic features, and photographers snapped images to sell as postcards. She was not allowed to leave the enclosure, not allowed to speak unless spoken to, not allowed to be anything but the native the crowd expected. Her story, like those of her companions, was swallowed by the spectacle, leaving only fragments in the archives of a shameful history. These are not isolated tales. Ota Benga, the Igorot, the Vietnamese woman, they were among thousands whose lives were stolen to feed the curiosity of empires. Their pain was real, their humanity undeniable, yet the crowds saw only what they were told to see, proof of a world divided by race, where some were born to rule and others to be displayed. As we move forward, let's step closer to the spectacle itself, to see how these human zoos were crafted to mesmerize and dehumanize. Step into the grounds of a colonial exposition, and you'd find yourself in a carefully orchestrated illusion. The human zoos were not haphazard displays. They were theatrical productions designed to captivate and convince. Imagine a sprawling fairground buzzing with the hum of excitement. Booths sell cotton candy and trinkets, while steam engines hiss and gleam under the sun. But at the heart of it all lies the main attraction, a village of straw and mud, its edges framed by wooden fences or iron bars. Smoke rises from a stage fire pit. Drums echo in a relentless rhythm, and the air carries the scent of earth and sweat. This is no village, it's a set, a caricature of a world the organizers have never seen but claim to understand. The people inside these enclosures were actors in a play they didn't write, men from Senegal, women from Sumatra, children from Madagascar. They were dressed in costumes that exaggerated their otherness. Loincloth replaced tailored clothing. Beads and feathers stood in for everyday adornments. Their daily tasks, cooking, weaving, or dancing, were choreographed to seem primitive, alien, even dangerous. In one corner, a man might be instructed to sharpen a spear, his every move watched by spectators who whispered about his wildness. In another, a woman might stir a pot over a fire, her face blank as she repeated the act for the 10th time that day. The crowd didn't see the exhaustion in her eyes or the calluses on her hands. They saw a story, one that confirmed their belief in their own superiority. The audience was part of the performance, too. Families strolled through the fairgrounds, guidebooks in hand, reading descriptions that labeled the people on display as cannibals or primitives. Children laughed and threw peanuts through the bars, encouraged by parents who saw no harm in the game. Men in suits sketched the scenes, their pencils capturing not lives, but stereotypes. Women in wide-brimmed hats posed for photographs beside the enclosures, their smiles frozen in images that would later be sold as souvenirs. Some spectators called out, demanding the natives dance or sing as if they were trained animals. And when the people in the cages complied because they had no choice, the crowd clapped, delighted by the show. Behind the scenes, the reality was grim. The villagers were often malnourished, given just enough food to keep them performing. They lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, their makeshift huts offering little protection from rain or cold. They were forbidden to leave the enclosure, their days dictated by the fair's schedule. Some tried to resist refusing to perform or staring defiantly at the crowd, but resistance came at a cost. A whip, a withheld meal, or a threat to their families back home ensured compliance. For many, the greatest pain was psychological, the knowledge that they were not seen as human, but as objects, their lives reduced to a grotesque parody for profit. The human zoos were a spectacle of power, a stage where empires displayed their dominance over the other, but they were also a mirror reflecting the cruelty and ignorance of those who built them. As we'll see next, the cracks in this mirror began to show. As voices rose to challenge the Horan, the world began to reckon with the shame of what it had done. The human zoos, with their straw villages and iron cages, were built on a foundation of arrogance and ignorance. But no empire, no matter how grand, can silence the voices of those it seeks to oppress forever. By the early 20th century, the cracks in the facade of these grotesque spectacles began to show. The world was changing, and with it came a growing chorus of voices, some quiet, some thunderous, demanding an end to the dehumanization. The fall of the human zoos wasn't sudden, but a slow unraveling, driven by the courage of those who dared to speak, the tragedy of those who suffered, and a world beginning to grapple with its own moral failures. The first tremors of resistance came from the very people who had been displayed. In the mock villages of World's Fairs, whispers of defiance circulated. Some, like the agora at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, refused to perform certain acts, their silent rebellions a testament to their unbroken spirit. Others, like a group of Senegalese men at a 1900 Paris exhibition, staged a protest by tearing down parts of their enclosure, only to face swift punishment. These acts were small, often unnoticed by the crowds, but they planted seeds of dissent that would grow. The exhibited people were not passive. They were survivors, clinging to their dignity in a world that sought to strip it away. Beyond the cages, intellectuals and activists, particularly from colonized communities, began to challenge the narrative of racial superiority that propped up the human zoos in Europe. African and Asian scholars, many educated in the very universities that once justified their oppression, started writing and speaking out. Figures like Félix Dubois, a French journalist of African descent, exposed the cruelty of colonial exhibitions in scathing articles, describing the living exhibit as a moral stain on Europe's conscience. In the United States, black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, who attended the 1900 Paris Exposition, used their platforms to argue that the displays were not science, but propaganda designed to dehumanize and divide. Their words, sharp and unyielding, began to pierce the bubble of imperial self-congratulation. The turning point came with the tragedy of Ota Benga. His exhibition in the Bronx Zoo in 1906 sparked outrage among a small but vocal group of African-American clergy and activists. Reverend James H. Gordon, a black pastor, led a campaign to free Ota, declaring our race is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. The protests drew attention, forcing the zoo to close the exhibit after just a few weeks, but the damage was done. Ota, haunted by his experiences, never recovered. In 1916, at the age of 32, he took his own life, a gunshot echoing as a condemnation of the world that had caged him. His death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a catalyst. Newspapers, even those that had once ignored the human zoos, began to question the morality of such displays. The public, slowly but surely, started to see the people in the cages not as curiosities, but as victims. The rise of human rights movements in the early 20th century further eroded the foundations of the human zoos. The horrors of World War I, which exposed the fragility of Europe's so-called civilization, forced a reckoning. How could a continent that had descended into such carnage claim superiority over anyone? Meanwhile, anti-colonial movements gained momentum across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, demanding self-determination and dignity. By the 1930s, colonial expositions were losing their luster. The 1931 Paris Colonial Exposition, one of the last major human zoos, faced protests from both colonized peoples and European intellectuals. The once packed enclosures began to draw fewer crowds as the spectacle of human suffering lost its appeal in a world awakening to the ideals of equality. By the mid-20th century, the human zoos were largely gone, consigned to the shadows of history. The rise of the civil rights movement in the United States and decolonization efforts worldwide made such displays untenable. But therein was not a triumph, it was a belated admission of guilt. The cages were dismantled, but the ideas that built them lingered embedded in policies, attitudes, and prejudices that would take decades to unravel. The fall of the human zoos was a step forward, but it was only the beginning of a much longer journey toward justice. As the final straw huts were torn down and the iron bars rusted away, the human zoos faded into history, leaving behind a question that refuses to die. How could this happen? They called it science, a way to study the other and prove the West's progress. We see it now as cruelty, a grotesque betrayal of the very humanity it claimed to celebrate. But as we look back, the story of the human zoos isn't just a chapter in a dusty history book, it's a mirror, reflecting the shadows of our past and the challenges of our present. Consider this: the crowds who laughed and pointed at Ota Benga, the Igorot, or the Vietnamese woman weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, parents, teachers, shopkeepers caught in a web of ideas that told them this was normal, even noble. They believed they were witnessing progress, that the cages were a natural order, a proof of their place at the top of imagined hierarchy. But what happens when we accept a lie as truth? What happens when we let curiosity curdle into cruelty? The human zoos weren't just about the people inside the cages. They were about the people outside them and the stories they chose to believe. Have we truly left those cages behind? The physical bars may be gone, but the echoes of their ideology persist. In the stereotypes that linger in media, in the biases that shape policies, in the way we sometimes other those who are different, don't we still build cages, just in subtler forms? The human zoos were a spectacle, but spectacles don't vanish. They evolve. Reality shows that exploit news cycles that dehumanize, algorithms that amplify division. Are these not modern stages where we perform our prejudices? This story isn't just about the past. It's about us. It's about the choices we make when we encounter difference, whether to understand or to judge, to connect or to exclude. The human zoos ended because people spoke out, because they refused to let suffering be entertainment. But that fight isn't over. It lives in the questions we ask ourselves today. What do we cheer for? What do we ignore? And what do we allow to pass as normal? So here's the final question, the one that might stay with you long after this video ends. If we could cage people for entertainment once, if we could justify it as science, as progress, as fun, what does that say about us now? Are we truly free of those cages, or are we still building them? One assumption, one stereotype, one glance at a time. The answer isn't in the past. It's in the mirror. Look closely.